In the previous videos, we introduced demand curve, supply curve, and market equilibrium. And today we'll be working within the same model. So if you weren't sure about some of those concepts, feel free to reach out. But we had a demand curve, and what the demand curve showed us was that at each possible price, there is a certain quantity that consumers in the market are willing and able to purchase. All right, some consumers are willing and able to purchase at a higher price than other consumers. And so there is what we call this maximum willingness to pay for a consumer, which is the highest price that you're willing and able to pay for a good. And again, this varies person by person. All right, the concept of consumer surplus shows us basically how happy someone is after purchasing. In other words, we measure it as the difference between what consumers are willing to and able to pay and what they actually did pay, the market price. We can have the same concept for suppliers, producers, right? So some producers would have sold at a lower price. So the difference between the market price, what producers actually receive for selling their product, and the firms that the price they were willing to pay is producer surplus. So let's do an example here. Suppose that a consumer and a producer are negotiating over, say, a car. The buyer is willing to pay a maximum of $20,000 for this car, and the producer is willing to sell at any price over $15,000. All right, so suppose they negotiate a price here of $17,200. There's some consumer surplus created. This consumer would have paid $20,000, but only has to pay $17,200. So their consumer surplus is the difference. And likewise, the producer would have sold at $15,000, gets a price higher than that, so they get some producer surplus as the difference between their minimum willingness to sell and the market price. So what does this look like on the entire supply-demand graph? Well, remember, our demand shows us consumers' willingness to pay. Our supply curve shows us suppliers' willingness to sell. So this is demand curve is showing us that at a possible price of $11, there are one person or one unit demanded in this market. So if the market price was $6, this one person who would have paid $11 gets a consumer surplus of $5 because they would have paid $11 but only had to pay $6. Right? Likewise, there's some other consumer or set of consumers who are willing to buy a second unit at a price of $10. They would have paid $10 but only had to pay $6, so they get some consumer surplus and so on. All right, so the total consumer surplus in a market is this area of triangle, which is below the demand curve, but above market price. And again, it's showing us at each possible price, there's some consumer or consumers who would have purchased at that price, but they only had to pay a lower price. And so they get some consumer surplus. All right, well, down here on the demand curve, these are people who only would have been willing to pay, say, $5 for the product. The price is $6, they don't buy, they don't get any consumer surplus. All right, so only consumers who are willing and able to purchase at the market price and do make a purchase get consumer surplus. Likewise, we've got some producers in the market. Suppose we've got one producer who's willing to sell at $2, but the market price is $6. They get some producer surplus. And likewise, we've got a producer here or a set of producers that would be willing to sell at $3, but they get $6. So they get some producer surplus. All right, so the total producer surplus in the market is above the supply curve, below the price, and over here to the equilibrium. You will get occasionally some calculation problems where it's asking you to calculate the area of consumer or producer surplus or sum the two up. So if you need to calculate the area of one of these surpluses, we're going to use the area of a triangle formula, which is 1/2 base times height. So with this example here, we're multiplying, so it doesn't matter what you call the base or the height. Let's call this the base across this way. So we would have 1/2, 0 to 6. So that's 6, 1/2 times 6 times our height, which would be from 1 to 6. So our height is 5, right? The area of this triangle is 1/2 times 6. times 5. So 1/2 times 30 would be 15. All right, markets are efficient when they generate the largest total surplus. We have total surplus as our sum of consumer plus producer surplus. And the idea behind a free market is that free markets, in many cases, maximize the total sum of producer and consumer surplus. In other words, total surplus measures efficiency. So we have this clicker question here. When a market maximizes total surplus, it's a sign of what? And the market is not in equilibrium. Well, we're saying market in equilibrium in many cases does maximize surplus. Resources are being used efficiently. Seems like a reasonable answer, but let's check the other two. Consumers are receiving a positive net marginal benefit, but producers are not. We haven't really started talking about marginal stuff for marginal benefits here. Marginal benefit would be the benefit of consuming one more product, or in the producer's case, selling one more product. Well, remember, if the producers and consumers are selling in a market, the consumers must be getting some positive surplus, or they wouldn't be buying. Likewise for the producers. So both parties should benefit from trade here. Producers are receiving a positive net marginal benefit, but consumers are not. That's wrong for the same reason. Again, if we have these two parties mutually opting into this trade, then both should be benefiting. All right, so total surplus maximization is a sign that resources are being used as efficiently. Markets are operating at equilibrium. At the end of this chapter, we'll introduce some critiques of that theory, or some cases where this might not actually happen in practice. All right, again, total surplus, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. You need the area of a triangle formula. If you're asked to compute that area, there's a few example problems out there, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions. All right, so let's end this video with one more example problem on total surplus in a market. So Anisha needs a house cleaning service and her willingness to pay is $135. Zeke provides the service, wants to charge at least $95 per visit. So it's saying that Anisha's maximum willingness to pay is $135. Of course, she would enjoy paying a price less than that, but she would pay up to this price. Zeke wants to charge at least $95 per visit, perhaps would be happier to charge more, but wants to make this amount. All right, so the transaction would only be beneficial to both if Anisha and Zeke agree to the price of $115, which is right in between. Well, if that happened, Anisha was willing to pay $135, but only has to pay $115, so she gets 20 surplus. Zeke gets 20 surplus as the difference between willingness to charge, willingness to supply, 95, and 115. So in this case, their total surplus is, their surplus is the same. Consumer surplus equals producer surplus equals 20. If they agree on a price of 130, well, Anisha's willing to pay 135, so her surplus would be the difference, $5. Zeke only needs to charge 95, so Zeke would get a producer surplus of 35. But we can't say that only Zeke is benefiting because Anisha still has some consumer surplus here. Granted, it's a fairly small amount. All right, likewise here in C, if they agree on a price of $100, Anisha gets a consumer surplus of 35. Zeke still gets some producer surplus, $5. But so we can't say that only Anisha is benefiting. Anisha is benefiting more in this example, but Zeke still gets some producer surplus because he would be willing to sell at $95, but he gets 100. All right, so all three of these are wrong. By the process of elimination here, we've got to answer D. Regardless of the price they agree to, the total surplus from this transaction is $40. Well, in example A, the total surplus was 20 for each, 40 total. In example B, it was 5 for Anisha, 35 for Zeke, so that's 40. In example C, it was 35 for Anisha and 5 for Zeke. That adds up to 40. So in all of these examples, and indeed at any price in between their willingness to pay, the total surplus from this transaction would be $40. All right, so this is a good example of maybe kind of one of the moderate to more difficult exam problems. They're in multiple choice format, but many of them require you to go through and check every answer. So while there's only 25 of them, you do, in many cases, need to be careful, read the answers thoroughly, and be able to rule out all the incorrect answers. There should be one, fairly clearly correct answer, but it might not be that easy, quote unquote, to get to. All right, so in the next video, we will talk about what happens if a market is not in equilibrium.